It's June 19th here in Seoul, and I'm Kim Dami. We begin with these stories making the headlines at this hour, starting with President Yoon Suk-yeol's diplomatic mission to France and Vietnam. The South Korean leader will give a speech to promote his country's bid to host the 2030 World Expo. He will also pay a state visit to Hanoi later this week for broader economic cooperation. North Korea calls its failed spy satellite launch attempt a most serious failure. The regime hints that another launch attempt will take place soon. The entire world is burning up due to early summer heat waves. In fact, the South Korean capital issued this year's first heat wave advisory over the weekend. President Yoon Suk-yeol on Monday will embark on yet another diplomatic trip, this time to France and Vietnam. He'll round off South Korea's 30-minute presentation in Paris, hoping to convince the BIE that Busan is the right choice to host the 2030 World Expo. Our Kim Do-yeon reports.
After much anticipation, the top office finally confirmed that President Yoon Suk-yeol will make his speech to the General Assembly of the Bureau International des Expositions in Paris on Tuesday in English to boost Busan's bid for 2030 World Expo. While it was already announced that Yoon would be in Paris for the BIE meeting, his office has refrained from confirming direct involvement from the president. But with Saudi Arabia's Mohammed bin Salman attending the BIE to push, the top office decided not to hold back anymore. Along with this announcement, the top office also provided more details. The 30-minute presentation is regarded as one of the last opportunities for bidders to convince BIE's 179 member states. The top office also said the presentation will, quote, fill the 30 minutes allotted to it without a dull moment, with videos and presentations telling delegates why Busan should host the expo. The president will be the final speaker following Gangnam-style singer Psy, academics as well as big-name entrepreneurs. Karina of K-pop girl group aespa and soprano Jo Soo-mi will take part virtually. Meanwhile, President Yoon wrote an op-ed in French newspaper Le Figaro last week to share his vision of Seoul-Paris ties. He expressed his commitment to joining hands with France on security issues, including North Korea and the war in Ukraine, saying that rules-based global order and peace are under threat amid intensifying conflict between liberal democracy and authoritarian forces. He said he will work with NATO members, including France, to restore peace in Ukraine, and said he looks forward to working with Paris as South Korea is set for a seat on the United Nations Security Council as a non-permanent member. He also described Busan as a port city where young French soldiers landed during the Korean War to help defend South Korea, and a place that was once filled with war refugees only to become the city with the second largest transshipment volume in the world. As for his overseas trip, President Yoon, after his BIE presentation, will meet with French President Emmanuel Macron before a state visit to Vietnam on Thursday. Kim Do-yeon, Arirang News.
North Korea labeled its recent failed spy satellite launch a critical failure, while vowing another attempt in the near future. According to state media on Monday, the ruling Workers' Party of Korea, during a key plenary meeting of the 8th Central Committee with leader Kim Jong-un in attendance, said key goals to enhance defense capabilities have been accomplished, although there were some failures with the latest satellite launch among them. Party officials reportedly called for the cause of the failure to be analyzed so that a military reconnaissance satellite could be successfully launched. The regime also highlighted its latest missile and nuclear weapons developments and vowed further efforts. Top diplomats of the U.S. and China sit down for talks in Beijing. Now, no major breakthrough was witnessed during the 8-hour-long dialogue, but the two did agree to continue their talks next time in Washington. Choi Min-jung reports.
U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has met with his Chinese counterpart Qin Gang in Beijing on a widely anticipated mission to lower the heightened U.S. China tensions. Both sides called Sunday's meeting candid and constructive. In a statement, the U.S. State Department said Blinken stressed the need to reduce the risk of misperception and miscalculation. The State Secretary also made clear that Washington will always work with its allies and partners to advance its vision for a world that is free, open, and upholds the international rules-based order. Meanwhile, China's state media quoted Qin as having pointed out that U.S.-China relations are at their lowest point. Qin remained firm in urging the U.S. to abide by the One China principle and to commit to not supporting Taiwan's independence. Although no major breakthrough was achieved, the two sides noted the importance of facilitating people-to-people exchanges between the two countries. Blinken also invited Qin to Washington to continue their discussions. Blinken's two-day visit makes him Washington's highest-level official to visit China under the Biden administration. It also marks the first visit to China by a U.S. State Secretary in 5 years. Blinken had to delay his visit to China, which had been originally planned for February, due to controversy over an alleged Chinese spy balloon flying over U.S. airspace. Choi Min-jung, Arirang News.
South Korea has reportedly called on the U.S. to clarify its EV regulations under the Inflation Reduction Act that prohibits the sourcing of critical minerals and battery components from China. According to U.S. government, Seoul submitted comments saying the regulation should further be clarified in terms of defining a foreign entity of concern, which currently labels companies associated with the governments of China, Russia, and certain other states. Now, that could possibly be interpreted to include the majority of Chinese companies with no further detailed guidance. The South Korean government added the U.S. should take into account the global interdependency of battery supply chains. Under the IRA, vehicles that use batteries that contain any critical minerals sourced from a foreign entity of concern will be excluded from receiving subsidies from 2025. North Korea has carried out a key party meeting to overlook and discuss issues regarding diplomacy, economy, and defense. During the meeting, the regime described its failed satellite launch as a most serious failure. For more on this, we're joined by Professor Robert Kelly this morning. Welcome to the program.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Sure. The regime acknowledged the failed satellite launch as being its most serious failure in the first half of the year. Professor Kelly, what's your take on this?
Yeah, so I think the most curious thing about the discussion of the satellite has been that the North Koreans have admitted that it didn't work, that it failed, right? This is not sort of typical of the totalitarian regime. The North often sort of markets itself as sort of nearly perfect in what it manages to do. It almost never admits failure. That's part of its competition with South Korea, where South Korea has very obviously exceeded the North. And so its willingness to sort of say this and say it's serious and talk about this repeatedly, I think, is what has sort of caught people's attention. I think if I had to guess, I think there are really sort of two reasons for this. The first, it's very obvious that it failed, right? We know that the South Koreans have retrieved parts. We know that the rest of the world has sort of observed this, and this information might leak back into North Korea. We know that the information cordon around North Korea is not as tight as it once was. This was fairly spectacular. The South Koreans are, your images right there showing it. The South Koreans are pulling stuff out of the sea that have come from this. I think that's sort of the first reason. And I think the second reason is that is probably, again, we're sort of speculating here, is that the North Korean regime wants to make sure that its own internal scientific apparatus stays committed to constructing these things and building these things and keeps on trying and trying, right? And if the North Koreans' attitude towards failure is that scientists get, purged or they lose their privileges or whatever if these launches fail, right, then that means you can never admit failure, which means the scientists won't take the necessary chances and risks and stuff like that. In other words, for this program to succeed, the North Koreans have to be able to accept, the leadership has to be able to accept and admit failure, right, because you don't always work, right? I mean, nobody's space program is perfect. And so I think this is one of the reasons why the Kim Jong-un regime has been much better with these launches than the previous regime, Kim Jong-il, in part because the Kim Jong-un is a little bit more aware that these things aren't always going to go smoothly, and he's willing to admit that. And that should help, in the long term, that should help the program be more successful.
Right. The satellite launch does appear to be the regime's top priority now that it's mentioned in its key party meeting as well. And the North...
I think it's pretty clear that the North Koreans want to actually develop greater satellite intelligence over South Korea, right? I mean, North Korea increasingly is not a conventional threat to South Korea so much as it is a missile threat, right? The North Korean army is very large, but it's fairly out of date, right? There are a lot of sort of questions about the health of its soldiers or whether or not it has enough fuel for its vehicles. I would argue the real threat to South Korea is North Korean missiles, and that means better targeting, right? If the North Koreans are actually going to strike sites in South Korea, U.S. bases, South Korean cities, things like that, Route 1, then the North Koreans need better data, right? They need better sort of mapping of what South Korea has, right? And presumably this means getting into space. They've really emphasized this a lot.
Right. And the North is also pledging to put another satellite into orbit soon. Now, how soon do you think is possible? I mean, how likely is it that the North will attempt to do so without giving notice this time?
Yeah, well, they won't give notice, right? Or if they do, it'll be sort of a short time before, right? The North Koreans are sort of notorious for not actually telling us stuff and just sort of like launching these. You remember when one fell near the Philippines a few years back, right? The Filipinos were really sort of caught off guard about that. I was in the Philippines at the time, and there was quite a hubbub over that. I would imagine the North Koreans will probably do this in the next 6 months to a year. When the North Koreans say these kinds of things, there's usually some kind of follow through, not immediate. But the North Koreans have been pretty consistent, right, on this kind of stuff. It's pretty clear that Kim Jong-un wants a missile program and he wants a satellite program to complement it, to help with targeting, as we talked about. And so I would imagine that, this will happen in the next 6 months to a year.
All right, at least several months to prepare for another launch attempt. Now, the North also says it's achieved progress in development of weapons, including nuclear weapons and also missiles. What could it be referring to? I mean, could it be in relation to its Hwasong-18 ballistic missile and possibly its 7th nuclear test?
Yeah, so I think the 7th nuclear test is coming. Although, to be honest, at this point, it's kind of up in the air, right? I mean, the CIA and the NIS have been telling us all for a while, the analyst community. They've been telling us for a while, this thing was going to happen. Remember, it was supposed to happen last year before Christmas or something like that. But, if the North Koreans are going to have a nuclear missile program, right, they're going to have a nuclear program they have to test, right? And the North Koreans obviously want larger warheads. The bigger the warheads are, the more damage they do, the more they can threaten the United States directly, which is key to prevent North Korea, to keep the United States out of a South Korean conflict or a Korean conflict. That's what the North Koreans want, right? To deter the U.S. from entering a Korean conflict by threatening massive retaliation on the U.S. homeland. So they need to build bigger weapons, and these things have to be tested. So I would imagine that will happen. Same thing with the missile tests, right? Again, I would argue that the primary threat that North Korea now faces, presents to South Korea is primarily through missiles, right? The traditional conventional North Korean military is pretty out of date. So I would argue that the missiles are the real issue, and so they're going to keep on testing and testing and testing, because this is what they're going to do, right? If there's another conflict between the two Koreas, right, the North Koreans are going to strike South Korea all over the country. Military sites, the Busan port where I am, Route 1, all these things are going to be hit by missiles probably pretty early in the conflict. And so, I mean, this is the North Koreans' big competitive advantage against the South Koreans at this point.
That's a very good point, Professor. Now, the North has registered to compete in the Asian Games that's scheduled for this fall in China. Does it mean we'll see the North resume participation in other international events?
Yeah, that's a good question. The North Koreans are really all over the place on this kind of stuff, right? We invite them. They get invited a lot to these sorts of things, to different events and things like that. And sometimes they come and sometimes they don't. I think it would be a great idea if they did, right? People-to-people diplomacy is one area where maybe we can make a little bit of progress with North Korea at the diplomatic level. Obviously, it's pretty difficult, right? But I mean, actually trying to sort of like talk to regular North Koreans, trying to sort of have students, for example, who go to European universities or sort of go to China or something like that, and they get to see a little bit more of how modern societies function. These things are valuable. Having North Korean athletes go to events and sort of see that the rest of the world operates, in a way much less hostile than the way North Korean propaganda presents it. All these things I think are valuable, right? It'd particularly be a good idea if South Korean and North Korean athletes can interact with these kinds of things. But it's just not clear to me that the North Koreans have made any kind of a big shift on this. As far as I know, there's been no major pronouncement from Kim or the people around him that there's some big policy shift here. It seems like the North Koreans just sort of decide on a case-by-case basis.
Right, then does that mean the North's participation in the Asian Games mean that they're over or done with the pandemic, because the rest of the world has entered the endemic phase, right?
Yeah, that's actually a good question, too. My sense is that the North Koreans never really took the pandemic that seriously, right? I mean, the regime has a sort of a pretty harsh history, right, regarding its concern for its own people and when they're suffering, right? I mean, it famously allowed several million people to starve to death in the late 1990s. And, we know that malnutrition because of state policy has been an issue in North Korea for decades, right? So it's actually, I wouldn't surprise me at all if the North Korean attitude towards COVID is that, well, that's something that didn't really happen to us, and it was just a fever, and that was something that happened in Western decadent societies, and we're moving right along, right? So yes, I would argue that this is probably an example of the North Koreans, just sort of moving away from COVID, and it never really happened, and it's just sort of a part of the past, and whatever. It was this brief sort of weird interlude, it was this interregnum, and now it's over and we're back to normality. Yeah, that fits very much with the way North Korea, addressed COVID, which is in some way to basically ignore it.
Right. Still, it'll be cool and refreshing to see North Korean players back on the games on international level.
It would help a great deal, yes.
All right, Professor Kelly, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you for your time. Thanks for having me.
Seoul City issued its first heatwave advisory this year as temperatures soared during the weekend. And South Korea's capital was one of many cities around the world to be hit with unusually high June temperatures. Our Moon Hae-ryun tells us more.
Many countries around the world are sweltering under a June heatwave, and Seoul was the latest to feel the heat. On Sunday, the city was issued with a heatwave warning as temperatures soared to nearly 33 degrees Celsius during the day. It's expected to be even hotter in Seoul on Monday. A heatwave warning is issued when the feels-like temperature of 33 degrees or higher is expected to be recorded across 2 or more days in a row. The government immediately activated its Emergency Operations Center in response to the warning and will be checking in regularly with the elderly and homeless to ensure they are safe and well over the coming days. Other cities around the world were also affected heavily by the heat. Nearly 100 people died in 2 of India's most populous states of Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, according to AP News. A further 154 people in northern India were admitted to hospital with heat-related symptoms. Most of these casualties were people aged over 60 with chronic diseases that were made worse by high temperatures, prolonged exposure, or dehydration. The average high temperature in the area peaked between 40 and 45 degrees, 5 degrees higher and 25% drier than usual as a result of the delayed monsoon season. Mexico City was also hit with its hottest ever recorded June temperature, and Florida was issued a heat advisory on Sunday with temperatures soaring to 42 degrees. The Climate Prediction Center in the United States confirmed earlier in the month that El Niño conditions were present, leading to hot and dry weather in the north and wetter periods in the south of the U.S. El Niño is a climate pattern during which sea surface temperatures are higher than average in the tropical Pacific Ocean, affecting global average temperature. It last occurred in the spring and summer of 2019, but had a fairly weak impact. The European Union's Copernicus Climate Change Service reported that while there is still uncertainty about how strong the event will be this year, El Niño conditions are certainly underway. Moon Hae-ryun, Arirang News.
Efforts continue to be made to reduce traffic accidents in school zones here in South Korea now using AI, like the smart safety system that lowers jaywalking cases by up to 96%. Our Yoon has the story.
This is a crosswalk in front of an elementary school in Hwasong City. When the pedestrian light turns red, people cannot walk into the street because of a barrier that closes to stop them. When the light turns green again, the barrier is raised for the people to cross. This is a smart school zone pedestrian safety system. Artificial intelligence has been incorporated to not only operate the barriers according to the traffic lights, but the barrier also provides audio assistance. This system has been installed particularly around school zones to prevent traffic accidents caused by children jaywalking.
The children see the barrier and become more careful when crossing the street. As a parent, it's a relief.
This system has been installed at 36 crosswalks in front of elementary schools around Hwasong City. Data from 7 of these crosswalks show the number of jaywalking cases has dropped from 141 before the installment to 4 afterward, a decrease of 96%.
A 96% decrease in jaywalking means this system is efficient. We will be adding 10 more installments this year.
Hwasong City will use the feedback from the current trial operation of the AI crosswalk barrier system and make any necessary improvements before starting normal operation. It's hoped that the safety system may then be actively introduced to other local governments. Yoon, Arirang News.
Good morning, I'm Matthew Ashley, and we now turn over to stories from around the world. Now, efforts by a number of African nations to end the war in Ukraine have been dismissed by Kyiv and Moscow. Leaders and representatives from countries including South Africa, Egypt, Senegal and Zambia failed to convince Russian President Vladimir Putin and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to begin peace negotiations. Now, during talks in St. Petersburg on Saturday, South African President Cyril Ramaphosa presented Putin with a 10-point peace initiative. But Putin largely dismissed the plan and accused Ukraine of being unwilling to talk. Zelensky also rebuffed the proposal, saying in a meeting the previous day that negotiations would just, quote, freeze the war. The war has heavily impacted Africa, as exports of grain from Ukraine and fertilizer from Russia have been restricted, increasing global food insecurity. Now, in Uganda, burials took place on Sunday for 42 people killed in a suspected rebel attack on Friday night on a school near the Congo border. Now, the attackers killed 38 students, 3 civilians, and a school guard. Local officials suspect that another 6 students might have been abducted. The attack has been blamed on the Islamic State-linked Allied Democratic Forces. The attackers used guns and machetes and set fire to a dormitory, burning those inside beyond recognition. The ADF is accused of launching a number of attacks against civilians over the past few years in remote areas of the country. Most recently, it was blamed for an attack in March that killed 19 people. Now turning over to the United Kingdom, where the trooping of the Colour Parade returned over the weekend, led for the very first time by King Charles III. The monarch joined 1,500 soldiers, 300 horses and hundreds of musicians marching from Buckingham Palace to Horse Guards Parade in St. James Park. Although the parade is held every year, it was the first time in over 4 decades that a monarch has ridden on horseback in the procession. The event is a royal tradition, publicly celebrating the birthday of the British sovereign. UK monarchs typically have 2 birthdays, with the real birthday celebrated in private and the other celebrated by the public in warmer weather. King Charles III's actual birthday is in November. And finally, Brussels wrapped up its annual Pedal Boat World Championship this weekend. The event took place over 2 Sundays in the Belgian capital, officially starting on June 11th. Teams tried to complete as many laps as they could in 4 hours around a 420-meter circuit at a lake in the Bois de l'Encambre Park. 22 teams took part this year, mainly from Belgium, but also with some teams from Spain, France and England. The winning team managed to complete a total of 54 laps. Competitors wore colorful costumes with themes such as Where's Waldo?, Pirates and the 80s.
Good morning. What a sweltering weekend we had. The season's first heat wave advisory was issued on Sunday in Seoul, and Yangyang in Gangwon-do province had tropical nights over the weekend as overnight temperatures stayed above 25 degrees Celsius. Well, tropical nights in June started last year, and even this year's record came 10 days earlier than the previous year. And today, strong sunshine will give us no relief from the heat. UV rays will be very high and ground level ozone will also rise during the day today. So please try to avoid outdoor activities during the hottest parts of the day. Brace for a searing heat wave if you're in the west with an expected high of 35 degrees Celsius. Drink plenty of water even though you don't feel thirsty. Meanwhile, the eastern regions of Gyeongju, Daegu, and Gangneung, which had simmering heat over the weekend, will have welcome relief this afternoon. Then heat relief is on the way with rain that's starting tomorrow in southern regions, which will gradually spread nationwide on Wednesday. Well, that's Korea for you, and here's a look at the international weather conditions.
Thank you for watching New Day at Arirang. Have a wonderful day.